Hey there, and welcome back to the Road to ProveIt 2026. By the time you see this video, we'll be almost 72 hours away from the start of ProveIt. But before I hop on the plane to Dallas, I want to show you one last thing. Today I want to show you exactly how we built out the MCP experience that you're going to see at ProveIt 2026. Alright, let's dive right in. So MCP can seem daunting at first, but it's actually pretty simple. See, the way that MCP works is kind of like a phone book. Don't think about this as a web server, think about it as a directory that connects you to all of the different things that you might need in the process of getting an answer. So for instance, if you ask a question like, hey, what's the weather in San Francisco? You would expect your LLM to not just make up an answer, but to actually go find that answer. And that may have a lot of steps involved. You might have to find the coordinates for San Francisco. You might then have to provide those through an API to get weather data. There's all sorts of things that could happen between when you ask the question and when you get the actual answer. MCP basically allows you to set up all of those tools and resources, and then provide links to those tools and resources so that LLMs can actually use them to get your answer and to be accurate. So when you're looking at how this is laid out in Flowfuse, you need to abstract away the fact that this request is coming from outside of the system. In other words, unlike typical flows, you don't have a node that says AI request in. Instead, what you have is a series of nodes that can define exactly what the LLM should be looking for. Now, because of the nature of the data that we're using at ProveIt, this is all built around the MCP tool node. But if you have more static assets, you can use something like MCP resource. Or if you have specific prompts that you want the agent to use, you can use the MCP prompt node. I can ask the LLM to find out information like the worst performing site in all of our data. Now, when I make this request, what it's going to do is look at any of the tools and their descriptions that fit our request. Now, you can see while that was processing that our LLM actually called a tool called getLatestDataService. And that is a tool that retrieves all of the data from our time series database and tells us exactly which site is performing quite low. In this case, it looks like Site 1. Okay, so if I want to send someone to Site 1 to look at why it's performing that bad, I can ask a question of the LLM like, who's the site manager? As you can see, Site 1 is managed by one Dennis Sandoval. Now, the tool that the LLM used to get this information is called getSiteManagers. So let's take a look at how that tool is actually built. So the first thing that we want to do is define the tool itself. This tool, as I said, is called getSiteManagers, so we're providing that as both the name and the title. Now, notably, we're also providing a description that says exactly what this tool is and how it works. In this section, we have some annotations that allow us to give some hints about how this tool actually works. First of all, it's read-only. We're not actually permitting any writing to the resource that we're pulling this information from. But we are making it clear that this tool could interact with things in the open world and are not necessarily limited to the environment that we're working in. So when our LLM triggers the MCP server to actually use this tool, what first happens is this node is triggered. From there, the next node in the chain is activated, in this case, query. Now, as you can see here, we're selecting all from the table site managers and we're ordering by manager ID. Now, this data lives in Flowfuse tables, and it basically just gives us the answer to who the manager is for a particular site, as well as their location and their address. So once that information is pulled from the table, we then use the MCP response node to send it back to the MCP broker and thus to the LLM. So that's a very simple flow, but what if we had something more complicated? What if we wanted to find another person who could report to Site 1 because Dennis is out of office? So as you can see, the LLM is querying all of the tools that it has available and has detected that the next nearest site manager is actually D. Gotti, who manages Site 2 located in Reno, Nevada. But I want to know if the drive from Reno to San Francisco is reasonable and if the weather is fair. Now, we asked a compound question, so it's actually going to trigger the tool twice. And in this case, we have the getCurrentWeather tool. We can see here that the drive is approximately 218 miles, which is quite a far drive, but the good news is that the weather is clear in both locations. Now, the way that this tool works is similar to getSiteManager, but it's a little bit more complicated. To start with, we use the MCP tool node to define that we have a tool, in this case, getCurrentWeather, but we're also using the input schema area to basically tell the system what it should be expecting for its input. From there, we triggered this function node. Now, this node does a couple of things, but most importantly, the first step it does is to set a constant for its locations and normalize some of the text. Now, this was programmatically pulled out of the table using Flowfuse Expert, so if we were building this out to support more sites or support more locations, all we would have to do is ask the expert to help us out. We also make it clear here how exactly we should build our API request. And once that request is fully formed, we send it through our HTTP request node. Now, this will just send the request out to the API, and when it returns, we'll use another function node to basically format the response for our MCP. You can see in this bottom section that we're basically summarizing all of the data that we got back from the API and making it something that is more useful and contextual. With that, we simply return the information back to the MCP and out to the LLM. Now, when you're building something like this out, it's best to think about each question and what resource and tooling it might need to actually accomplish the question that's been asked. So in this instance, I needed to know a whole bunch of information about my different sites, as well as the structure of the tables in case there was some lack of clarity about which data I should be looking at. But I also need to know the site info, the site manager info, and then the weather for the site managers themselves. But that's not one big question, that's lots of tiny questions. The smallest question is, what is the data from my database? And you can see that's our first tool. If we run into an error with understanding how that data is formatted, well, now there's a tool for query structure. But we're definitely going to have to know about the site, so there's a get site info tool. And the site info tool tells us who the managers are, but we don't know any more information about the manager except for their name. So we need the site manager info to be able to be pulled in as well. But if we need weather information, we can't just ask the AI to make up the answer or find some way to answer our question. So in that case, we have another tool, get current weather. And if we wanted to store this data outside of Flowfuse tables, like the site manager info, well, we could store that in a function as an array and use the MCP resource node. That would be useful if we're building an array with variables from the environment itself. So you have a bunch of Groove Rios that are putting out data and you want to make that a resource that can be read by the MCP, but you don't want to connect MQTT or RequestDB or any other database solution. In that case, you could just store it as a global context and call from the function. There's all sorts of things that you could do with these nodes, but the most important element here to consider is exactly which tool is going to be used for which aspect of the question that you want to ask. So take your question, break it down into individual pieces, and then think, what resource would I need to know, or what tool would I have to deploy to answer that question? And it's just that simple. Now we're going to be doing a full demonstration of this at ProveIt itself, so keep your eyes on this channel for the full video from the conference in the next coming weeks. So as you can see, building MCP on Flowfuse is actually really easy. You can surface a ton of data through this tool, but more importantly, you can get a ton of insights very quickly. That means better and more informed decision making across the board. This demonstration will be part of our booth at ProveIt 2026, so if you're attending, go ahead and stop by, check it out in person, and say hello. And with that, we're ready to hop on the plane and go to ProveIt. I hope you liked this video. If you did, please give it a like, comment, and subscribe. This has been Christopher Sandoval. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in Dallas.